Hi, this is Dr. Chandler again, and this is the project risk identification project scenario. And in this video, we are going to be dealing with the same project that we have described and talked about in the introductory course and in the planning for risk management. So let's get going here. So let's review the environmental factors that we discussed in the previous videos that existed for this project. So it's a professional association that is, that's the organization that's engaging in this project, and they were located in Washington, D.C. And their organizational units didn't have a history of cooperating and collaborating with each other. And they had a brand new chief information officer who was considered an outsider by the existing senior executives that were in that organization. And they had an existing association management system that functioned well, but it was out of date, it was slow, it didn't work with the internet, it didn't work with mobile devices. There was a lot of things with it that it produced data well, but it just wasn't with the times. And the senior executives, the CIO and all the other senior executives, were meeting with vendors of newer systems, and they were presenting their options, their off-the-shelf systems. And all of those systems had the kinds of visual effects in a system that the individuals in the organization were impressed by and were seeking out. They wanted those new glitzy pieces of functionality, and they wanted to change from their existing system to something that could give them all of those features and functionalities. And this organization didn't have any formal project management processes in place. So with that as their environmental situation, their first objective when they created this project was to buy one of the off-the-shelf systems and begin loading their existing data in it and start using it. And their idea was that they could begin to garner the benefits of using a new system right away. Well, they also recognize and acknowledge that any new off-the-shelf system was not going to meet 100% of their needs. It was not going to be a complete replacement for their existing system. So simultaneously, they would keep running their existing system, and they would engage in this gap, they were calling it gap analysis project, under a cost plus fixed fee contract with the same vendor to identify the gaps, and then the idea was to prioritize those and then to develop those into their custom, and then stagger those and schedule those and implement those into their custom version of the system. That was the plan, and they were thinking that they would need at least a year for this entire project. And in this context, there wasn't any formal or even any informal risk management planning that was done, so there was no risk management plan. Okay, so with that as the background, now the fun begins. Let's start talking about identifying risks within this context. Now, there ends up being a lot of data about each risk that gets identified that needs to be documented and tracked. So some sort of risk tracking is going to be necessary, and there are some very simple approaches that are called maybe a risk register or a risk tracking sheet or something like that. And each organization can have its specific name for what they call this and which pieces of information they want to document about each of the risks. And there's risk management software that exists that can assist with this. So we're not going to dig into, in this course, we're not going to dig into that aspect, like what are all the variables about a risk that need to be documented. We're going to focus just on identifying the risks. So, because in some organizations, this risk management, risk mitigation responsibility is part of the project manager's responsibilities, and they're doing this with some what you could call semi-manual tools. So they're just using Word and Excel tracking sheets to assist them as they're doing this. So what we're going to do next is go through the example risks that you read already and commented on in this course. And we're going to examine each of those, and those were in categories, remember? And we're going to examine those and then consider this project and determine which ones apply to this project. And of course, it's easy after the fact to identify risks for a project that's already ended. As they say, hindsight is 20/20. But one of the challenges that some people have who are new to project management or new to the idea of needing to address risks before they occur is this idea of predicting the future. Some people say that feels really bizarre to them. How can they possibly know what's going to happen in the future? And they just feel really awkward even trying to speculate about what could happen. And I think because they feel a little bit foolish if they say, oh, this could happen or this could happen, and they're identifying things that have a low likelihood of happening. And then if they don't happen, they feel like, oh, I was wrong, I didn't predict accurately. When that's not what risk mitigation is all about at all. It isn't actually when you examine the full scope of all of the risks that could occur and then they don't occur, that's a time to celebrate, not to feel bad that you didn't predict accurately. That's not what risk management is about. So those who are involved in risk mitigation need to be comfortable doing this kind of activity. And looking at a project that has already ended and analyzing the risks, that's a good learning location because that's a safe place for a project manager or a risk manager, whatever the title might be in any particular organization. That's a good place for somebody to learn. All right, so the first area was project risks related to executive support. And I'm not going to read each of these items to you. You, like I said, you read these and you have that document available to you in the perusal part of the course. So you can always download that if you want. And these are all of the risks that we're going to cover in this video are in that document. So you could, like I said, you could download that if you wanted to. But now, regarding our example project, the third and fourth one in this group, I hope that you can see how that could have applied, how those risks were relevant for this project. Since the CIO was new and was seen as an outsider from the day they joined the organization, that was evidence that there already were some conflicts between that person and the existing stakeholders. And whether you call them conflicts or differences of backgrounds or whatever you call them isn't the point. It's that noticing these things and being able to recognize that these are risks is the important thing here. And with this particular project, the project itself did become the punching bag between the executive decision makers within this organization as they tussled for control, not necessarily control of the project, but certainly there was some power struggles within the organization, and this project was something that was used in competitively amongst those senior executives, and that can be common with large projects that have big budget line items. When a lot of resources are identified as going to one particular project, that's going to catch a lot of senior executives' attention. And because there was already competition amongst the senior executives in this organization for resources, this project itself got a lot of attention, and there were risks around this. There was also the risk of the CIO abruptly leaving the organization and deciding it wasn't a good fit for them. And then what would become of the project. So those were some of the risks related to executive support. Now moving on to project risks related to scope. Gold plating and scope creep were definitely risks for this project, as the individuals who were participating in the initial gap analysis sessions with the vendor saw that as an opportunity for them to go ahead and insert things that were really coming from their pent-up demand regarding the existing system. They saw that as a great opportunity. Let's just slot that in here. Wouldn't that make sense? To just, these were things that had been requested of the existing system some time ago, and they never got around to them. Wouldn't that just make sense to go ahead and get them implemented in the new system? And from one place of logic, that seems to make sense. So that's what started happening with this project. Now to discuss cost. There's only a couple of items listed here, but there's actually a lot related to cost, because really everything else, all the other areas have an impact on cost at some point with a project, right? So this vendor had a history of creating these types of enterprise systems, but they didn't have a history, and they didn't specialize in custom development. So they didn't have that. Their customizations up to this point were things like putting an organizational logo into the system, or changing the color schemes, or adding a field here or there in the data collection areas of their off-the-shelf systems. So the customizations and the tailoring that they had done up until this point for their customers was really very, very minimal. And what they were embarking on with this organization, with this project, was drastically different. And they didn't have previous projects to use to develop any realistic cost estimates on, and that created a risk for this project. Now, related to change management. Unfortunately for this project, all of these items apply to this project. And the enormity of the risks in this change management area can signal that perhaps a project is trying to accomplish too much too fast. And this is something that the people involved with the project could sense even before the design phase began. There was a sense that things were too good to be true. And perhaps because their sense of that was so vague that at the very beginning of the project, that they didn't feel they could speak up because they didn't have hard data. They didn't have hard data to go by, to present, to support their claims that, hey, look, this is a risk. This is an area that we should be concerned about. I can't see how this project is going to reach that goal by those time frames, given all these risks. There were people that had that feeling, but they weren't speaking up in the very beginning of the project. They just had feelings of trepidation about the project. Okay, now moving on to stakeholders. So because the stakeholders didn't have a history of collaborating, they had this history of competing with each other. Many of these project risks related to this project. And also, the longer the project went on, the stakeholder commitment started dropping. Related to the longer the project went on, it just continued to go lower and lower and lower. And part of that was perhaps because the representatives from each of the organizational units that were participating in the gap analysis, those were some of the individuals who were having these sensations that how in the world were we possibly going to accomplish all of this in this really short time frame. They just didn't think that was going to be possible. They were starting to provide those messages back up through their units, and that was impacting the drop in the stakeholder commitment. Now let's talk about the category of communication and the risks that can be related to that. So there was only one project manager assigned to this project, and that person was new to project management. And previously, they had served in the organization for several decades as a programmer, and they had intimate knowledge of the existing system and the data structures. And so from that perspective, they were a great person to have involved with the project. But they had never managed any project of any size before. So this person invested a great deal of their time in meetings in which they were just sitting there waiting for their turn to present, maybe 4 or 5 bullet points about this project and where it was at in the very beginning. And there was a lot of pressure on this individual to present only good news. Because there was no project management practices within the organization, because this person was brand new to project management and they didn't have training in project management. This person didn't have a skill set in how to bring bad news and how to discuss that comfortably with senior executives in the organization. And so my role with this project was after the project was initiated, I was assigned to mentor this new project manager. And in that role, I wasn't allowed to sit in on those meetings. I tried to prepare the project manager for those meetings, and I tried to stress the importance of bringing a full, clear picture of what was going on the project to the senior executives. And in the very beginning of the project, like I mentioned before, about how there wasn't any hard data to go on to be able to quantify and point to and say, see these issues, these are definitely, we can predict that these are for certain going to cause these problems later on, which are going to prevent success on this project. We couldn't do that at the very beginning of the project. So there was a lot of challenges in trying to teach project management principles to this brand new project manager who was already feeling incredibly overwhelmed, but also very proud to have been selected to lead this project and who believed in the project. That project manager 100% believed in this project and that it could be a success, and that all they needed to do was to face every obstacle and just give it more time and energy. That was this project manager's general strategy. The challenges was invest more time and energy, and any problem can be overcome. So now let's take a look at the risk category. You can combine some of the risk categories on that risk example sheet that you can download from Perusal. There's an awful lot of categories included there, right? And for some organizations, it might make sense to combine some of those into larger categories. You could also separate them out. You could also leave some of them out. Everyone can make those kinds of decisions, but to the extent that having a list like this to start with of possible project risks that could apply to the type of project that a project manager is taking on is very helpful. So one of the risks for this example project was that the team of analysts provided by the vendor to work with the organization to conduct the gap analysis, they were very young and inexperienced. They came to all the meetings with enthusiasm, and they tried to document and understand everything that was being presented to them. They were friendly, they were energetic, but because they were so new to their own organization, they didn't really have a full understanding of what the off-the-shelf system, what the data structures were and what it could and couldn't do. And they had no knowledge of what the existing system within the organization could and couldn't do and its data structures. So whenever they got asked questions, they would just smile and explain that they would document what the questions were, and they would take those back to their organizations and back to the vendor and then get back to us. And so that was the feeling in in all of the initial gap analysis meetings that we were having. All right, now the project risks related to design. Now, no one in the vendor organization really understood the differences at the data relationships level that existed and needed to be taken into account, because this professional association's members were not individual people. The members were organizations. And that was a fundamental difference between a professional organization that serves its members, and those members are people. So that was something that this vendor, like I said, didn't really fully understand. They thought, oh, how could that possibly matter? We collect organizational data, and we have people data, and you need people data and organization data. Yes, those are true statements. But the fact that the members are people, or if the members are organizations, that makes a big difference in the data relationships that have to exist within the database, and then the system that is collecting and organizing and using and then reporting on those data. So their assertion that their system could be tailored to meet easily tailored to meet this organization's needs, it started to raise eyebrows, at least for some of us who were involved on the project. All right, risks related to technology. Now, almost all of these applied to the project, as there was no security checks that had been performed, and the system that was going to be replaced was at the heart of all of the, not all of them, but many of the organizational functions and the services that it provided to its constituents. And there was a customized approach that was applied within the organization to provide a customization for each of the organizational units. And that is not what the off-the-shelf system was, the way that was built. The off-the-shelf system was built with an assumption that all organizational units would comply with and use whatever the standard data organization and nomenclature and everything else would be used. So that was going to be something that would be very different for this organization. The possible risks related to integration. So many of these risks are also related to the ones on the previous slide. And if the project had progressed, we got a little spoiler alert, right? If the project had progressed, the integrations that would have been necessary with the other core systems in the organization would have become an issue. Project risks related to requirements. So the project hadn't gone this far yet, as it had just, it was still in the gap analysis phase when the project was ended. But as those gaps were being analyzed, and if we had continued to analyze them, refine them into requirements, these kinds of risks would have come up. You can guess which ones of these would have continued, right? Like the things about the requirements being ambiguous. There was a lot of maneuvering amongst the individuals who were participating in the gap analysis from the different organizational units, trying to get it for the customizations to reflect just the way their organizational unit described things. And so all the organizational representatives were trying to do that same sort of manipulation. And sometimes the response was to create requirements that were really ambiguous. Instead of addressing the lack of agreement across the organizational units, the way that the requirement would be written would be so vaguely stated so as to apply to them all, but it was so vaguely stated that it wouldn't have been something that anyone could actually design and create because it was so ambiguous. Now, project risk related to organizational decisions and issue resolution. The people that were involved in that gap analysis that I've referred to in this video so far, they were there to provide information about what the current system did, how they used that, and to provide that end user perspective. They were instructed that they didn't have permission to make demands or to ask for new functionality, although they were clearly doing that. But it was always framed as if, oh, that's what we were about to do, or that's the way we did use it, right? So although they didn't have the authority to add new requirements, they were actually doing that. So that was something that was a kind of risk that probably would fall into this category. So the possible project risks related to procurement. This is a long list, and if all of them don't show up on the video screen, like I said, you have the full list in the reading that is in Perusall, and that's a PDF document that you can download and access. So many of these procurement risks could have applied. For example, the vendors could have stolen the ideas that were for the functionality and the tailored functions that were being discussed in the gap analysis meetings, and they could have created small, individual, encapsulated apps to provide that functionality and started selling that as add-ons to their core system. And that it was a possibility that fits within this list, but it wasn't really something that the organization would have been very concerned about. They probably would have went, okay, great, let them do it. Okay, and this one I've combined several from the original list. These risks related to, and these are similar to the ones we went over on the previous slide. And related to the comment that I just made, by the time the gap analysis had ended, it's possible that not only this the vendor that this organization was working with, but another vendor could have, by that time, could have developed this functionality in an off-the-shelf system that would have cost the organization much less to have just purchased that instead of investing all their time and resources into all of these customizations. That is something that could have happened. All right, project risks related to the organization and also to industry and external to the organization. So there's a lot of things that, and this gets back to the idea of not being able to predict the future, right? Like the second item on this list mentions, there can be all sorts of things that occur globally that can have an impact on your project that you can't possibly predict. But that in and of itself is a risk, and you can just put that item on your project. You can just say there could be one of these things that just completely changes the way our organization operates and perhaps stops the project or cancels the project, right? Because all of the organizational resources have to be shifted to other activities because of whatever this external thing is. That's something that could impact any project at any time. So these are helpful possible project risks to consider. Project risks related to user acceptance. Well, all of these could have impacted our example project, right? because remember I was saying about how they were defining things ambiguously because each representative was trying to steer it toward the way they did it using their nomenclature and their practices within their organizational unit, so that the actual item was being defined so vaguely. Well, if that had actually been implemented, well, then none of the users would have accepted that. They would all have, checked the reject box and say that doesn't do what we said it was supposed to do. So part of this comes from the fact that the existing system had been used within the organization for over 20 years, and they had built all of their operational practices around that system. The individuals had participated in designing the way that system works. So there was so much embedded. Trying to have one large project sweep away the old system and bring in a new system was an incredibly challenging thing for this organization to do. Okay, so now the project risks related to project management practices. So this is the last risk category that we're discussing in this video. And recall at the outset that I explained that in this organizational environment, they didn't have any project management practices, and they had very little project management knowledge amongst the individuals that they had assigned as managers of projects. So this was one of the most widespread risks that impacted the project, I would say, and because it impacted all those other things that we've discussed in this video so far. And it was unreasonable, I would say, I would claim, I would argue, it was unreasonable to promote a very knowledgeable but inexperienced programmer as a project manager and then only provide them with a mentor. That was me, remember? And then throw that project manager in the deep end of the pool before the project manager had learned to swim. The mentor approach might have worked with an experienced project manager who was unfamiliar with the organization or who was unfamiliar with the system. But with all of those, that combination of factors, it really, I say it was unreasonable. And sticking with our pool analogy, it was like, for me, it was like trying to teach someone how to swim they'd been pushed into the deep end of the pool by their organization. And every time they tried to splash their way to the edge of the pool and hang on, they were pushed back into the pool by the senior executives and told, no, don't cling to the edge of the pool. Swim, 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 swim. That's it. But that was the only instructions they were provided. Swim, swim. And the individual had no capacity to swim because they had never been taught to swim. They had never practiced any of the individual elements that are part of learning to swim. So, for example, they had never, operated in the shallow end of the pool where someone taught them how to comfortably put their head in the water and blow bubbles. They had never learned how to use a kickboard and to float and to kick their legs as part of learning how to swim in the shallow end of the pool where they could readily and easily put their feet down and stand whenever they felt unsafe. That was something that this project manager was never provided. And so this newly promoted project manager had no capacity to learn the project fundamentals of project management under these conditions.